But you've also got to appreciate that when someone hands over money for a risky bet, which is what a large chunk of these investments are, then their expectations on your diligence or your diligent behavior will be greater than you can possibly understand.
Hello, welcome to this podcast. We've got Chandila Fernando here. He's an investor, entrepreneur, public speaker, including a TED Talk in 2016. He's been a prime ministerial advisor. He's held professional roles for Barclays Global Business Solutions, the Sri Lankan Board of Investment and Metropolitan Group, among others. He's appeared on Sky and BBC as an expert commentator, active in the field of politics, going on his first election campaign in 1992. His interests include predicting global economic and geopolitical trends and forging relationships between Southeast Asia and the Western world. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, David.
It's great to have you.
I would like to meet that person you described. He sounds quite interesting.
Yes, well, let's see what let's see if he's here. So basically, this podcast is for tech founders. It's quite a small and niche group, those ones that are either thinking about raising investment, looking to raise investment, or in the process of raising investment. I'm also talking to founders that have raised investment, and that's the audience really is to get those insights into what it takes to raise the investment that you need to grow, but also talking to investors like yourself to see the other side, because they never really see it from the investor's point of view. So these questions really are aimed at that audience, and just to try and get some insights into your personal preferences. And you know, although you're just one investor, it might be that other investors feel the same as you. So it's always very interesting to talk to people like you. So thank you very much. I'll launch straight into sort of talking about the first point of contact you ever have with a founder. I mean, how do people typically reach you? Is it through LinkedIn or email, or is it telephone? Has there ever been anything novel or unexpected that you've been impressed by?
So I would say that's a really, really interesting one. I think it's very different, so I work with and on behalf of angel investors, have put money to things myself and lost money. So I think one of the hardest aspects is actually talking to people who could do something. So people try everything from sort of the V card and pitch deck to a sort of bait and switch, ask you for advice and then hope you'll give them money. And then, some people are just very comfortable in their own skin, have got a very clear elevator pitch, and talk to you in a way which you're a human and listen more than they talk. There are the usual networking things, but I do actually think a lot of the time you have to get to know, an angel investor's almost, for want of a better word, in a circle of a circle. So the types of people who advise them or who are on their radar, who's somebody that they would call, that is shoe leather, bit of luck, and a sort of a combination of the two. People have tried, the usual send you a LinkedIn, throw decks, the kind of sort of pump and dump, throw it at the wall as much as possible. It's not the best. I know people do it. They think there's a sense of satisfaction by sort of getting 150 decks out in as many minutes. But truth be told, I think less is more, and knowing what you're actually going to go and say to someone with a very clear ask, or if you're trying to learn, which I think is a better approach, is less about how weird and wonderful you are and what you've developed, more about the market and the target investor or investor's potential perception or assessment of the same. So I think you've got to remember, investors are people who invariably time poor, see a lot of things. Many of them can be considered mediocre, not all. And if you haven't got your story together, so it's a bit like sort of going for a class presentation where you didn't take your presentation with you, which doesn't help.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was interesting you said about your inner circle. So how would that kind of work then? Are you talking about your personal assistants or other members of your team, or how does that
No,
kind of work?
that's a good question. So when I say in a circle, there are people. I mean, this shouldn't come as a surprise to people. Um, London, Oxford, and Cambridge is, Golden Triangle. All the money is there, and you have plenty of cliches. So once you start getting out of that locality, or have a view on that locality, there are sort of a handful of business angel groups, angel networks, where go to an event, hit or miss, based on your day of choice. You kind of have to get to know people. But I think there's much to be had, from. I'm a big fan for things like panels, so getting to know panelists who might know people, getting to know VCs, even though they're not targeting your sector or your stage. They often know decent angel investors, building a rapport with those kind of people. So my inner circle, so to speak, is a range of characters like that cover everything from academia to people who own sizable businesses. When I say sizable, some of them are in excess of a couple of 100 million, but privately held, who have a very different take on life, just generally, on what they look to do, how they look to do it. Um and you stress test things with them. I think it's not. I think people often fall into the trap, and it's understandable that where you went to school, who you went to school with, is quite indicative of outcomes. To be fair, I have been very blessed in that regard. That's down to my late father's hard work and sending us to very expensive schools. So that gives you an ability to pick up the phone to people. And then, as a consequence of it, with my personal interests in things like politics, you get to know certain people who get introduced to uh, government officials, senior people in the civil service, things. There's a whole load of things that go through in how what you perceive as your 6 degrees of separation.
Mm.
And I think, I'm always trying to learn and to listen. That's, I mean, that might sound sort of strange to people, but I do think you've got to determine, right, just because you meet a top panelist or a keynote speaker or a lead from a VC, the principal, or the person that writes checks in that fund, or the head of an angel investment group, that does not necessarily guarantee that you're going to get the outcome that you're looking for.
Mm.
Um, and then people often want to go to existing founders who've successfully raised and said, well, how did you do it? There's only so many things that they can actually say about that. And then, who their investors are. Some investors don't really want to be known, even though there's a company's house filing. They really don't want to be bothered by people. That's just how they are. You have to respect that. But yeah, I think one, understand the landscape. Two, work out what your immediate ecosystem looks like. And three, very quickly understand if it is something whereby, say, for example, in the East and West Midlands, the angel investment ecosystem is quite fragmented. It's very difficult to get into. You don't know who's who or who has what. Then there's a whole load of people who spend an inordinate amount of time going to London, Oxford, and Cambridge and listening to things, and even travel abroad to go to various summits and conferences on these subjects. So it is very much working out who could be your linchpin, for want of a better word. I
Mm.
mean,
Mm.
again, there's lots of mentoring and advice services out there. Everything I do stuff for Enterprise Nation. In there, there's people who are silent angel investors. You genuinely, Dave, believe one of the hardest aspects for people. When someone says to you, write down your avatar investor, it's a very interesting process to do. But I've often found when you do that, you attract the complete opposite.
Mm.
You said, I want someone, argument's sake, using certain labels, perhaps an ex-professional in the city or someone who ran a business, exited for, I don't know, 15 to 20 million. Now, as an active angel investor, money's managed by so and so, has an appetite for this, and you populate this picture or try to get as many bits and pieces of information about a target individual. But I do think to a certain extent, life is, it's just not linear. We
Yeah.
would love to meet that avatar investor. I think what you're more likely, and a suggestion for people, is to think, right, okay, if I were to have somebody who was going to run the company, or was effectively the person who had the money and controlled the shots, what kind of person would get the best out of me as the founder or founding team? And I think that self-reflection, applying your own emotional intelligence, that is significant. A lot of people ignore that. If you're someone who doesn't like very, for want of a better word, very, very pressurized environments where the stakes are very high, where reporting is very stringent, because not every startup is this hotbed of activity that people are up till 3 o'clock in the morning, 5 days a week. That's not necessarily the case. But you've also got to appreciate that when someone hands over money for a risky bet, which is what a large chunk of these investments are, then their expectations on your diligence or your diligent behavior will be greater than you can possibly understand, even though you have an agreement between the two of you and an exchange of money. So I think it's having a sense of emotional intelligence, which is not easy.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was interesting that the balance between the kind of, like, say, the almost like the spray and pray approach to then, I'm always looking at that balance between that versus going after, like you say, an avatar and someone specialized in the market. I always find that, a lot of investors, that everyone's so different and individual. I'm just trying to think of like the best way to spark an initial bit of interest, which you can go to a wider audience and then get more specialized in when you have, people that say, okay, they put their hand up and go, yes, this is something that I'm interested by. How do you feel about that? Just that initial little bit of a contact. Can that?
So the bit of a contact, it's something you and I have spoken about previously, both in phone calls and in this beautiful thing called email and LinkedIn messaging. You really have to, as a founder or founding team, know what your problem and solution are to a T. And it must be, I mean, I've seen things that you've done in the past where you have very clearly in language that can even, I have this 5-year-old test. It sounds incredibly trivial. And it's born out of a lot of things that Guy Kawasaki talks about in terms of pitching, just generally. You must very clearly have a problem and solution defined.
Yeah.
If nothing else, if you have got those two things, you'll be amazed at the kind of conversations you could go and have. And there's also a temptation, even when you're reaching out to someone first time, let's assume you're doing it via email or LinkedIn or any other social media platform, is oh, hello, we are blah, 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 blah. This is what the person's like, okay, look, this is the next person that says something to me. If you could start with, right, dear so appreciate you received many requests. However, I'm within this airspace. Do you have any appetite, or would it be okay to send a little 4-line summary to you about some of the things that we're doing? This is not an immediate ask for investment. This is more about, okay, is this something that you would want to consider? So you've got to understand that. And there's also a cultural difference. Like in the US, people are much more used to short, sharp, punchy, yes or no, for want of a better word. If they don't like you, they'll tell you to your face.
Yep.
So and that's not necessarily representative of the whole of America, but so the pockets where VC money is quite mature, that's there. But then if you go under that layer, again, it comes to, okay, how do you create a conversation with someone?
Yeah.
So I think one of the challenges of sort of Gen Z, millennial plus, the different generations is how they communicate. But at the same time, the people with money, you always got to remember that something, people say, oh, it's the story, or it's you, the person, or it's you, the technology. No, you can't make that assumption. If you're introduced to someone, you've got to find a way to glean some information out of them without being intrusive. First and foremost, be true to yourself. Absolute cliche, but it's fundamentally important. And then say, right, okay, if I'm going to shape this conversation with their consent, I need to be able to tell them in 4 lines what's going on. And then the next stage would be, in my humble opinion, the classic one pager that really gives the relevant bits. Because if that one pager doesn't sit, you might get through those first bits, and then you get to the one pager and they go, no, not for me. And give people that opportunity to say no. do not be afraid of that. No, I'm not interested.
Yep.
If you can get a no, I'm not interested, and they're prepared to qualify the answer, that's very helpful. So I appreciate that this is not for you. Could you give me a couple of constructive pieces of feedback, if at all possible? Or is it just the sector, the size, or is it something else? And then most people, if you're polite, they will, even if they are someone who is is consistently tapped up for investment, they will turn around and go, yeah, this is why I think it doesn't work. And I think you learn more from conversations with investors that basically are not hostile towards you. I mean, that's a certain style, but more about this is what I think you are missing, or when you're looking at your commerciality or commercialization pathway, your MPV plus, this is where I think you could end up burning money and people are not going to like it.
Yeah.
Or you have traction with one or two signature clients, but do you really have the kind of insights from them as to what would be a 2 3 year relationship, whether it's SaaS or anything else? You need to get into those conversations, which I think there's a danger, because we are very digital,
Hmm.
that people forget that there's a human at the end of this
Yeah.
on both sides of the table.
Yeah, and that leads very nicely into the pitch deck. So once you've now gleaned an initial interest, your preference is to see a one pager. Other people's preference might be to see a full deck. But in any case, it's going to be something that has to have impact, right? So I know it's a bit of a big question, but I'm just thinking the absolute key elements of the pitch deck. What would you say that every single pitch deck or one pager must show you straight away?
Problem, solution, traction, ask, team. Those are the things. Underlying technology. I know people sort of try to talk about this and talk about patents, etc. I'm not disputing that. When you start getting into things like biopharma, medtech, agri-tech, there's going to be some discussion over that. But again, imagine, I always try to say to people, imagine somebody gets this. They're either about to get onto a plane and switch their telephone off, being asked to do that. You've got 2 minutes.
Yep.
Problem, solution, traction, ask, team. And when you have team, that's a very important thing. Some people say it's all about the team. You've got to describe everything. Do you have a competency, or do you have an understanding, or do you have both? And then people talk about non-advisory boards, right? So you've got one founder with like 20 people on their non-advisory board. Realistically, so always apply a test to yourself, is that if you were sitting on the other side of the table, how believable is that?
Mm-hmm.
3 to 5 people on an advisory board, maybe. And also, when you're starting, it's a confirmation bias, but it is fundamentally true. Investors generally across the spectrum are not a fan of solo founders because of risk. Something happens to you, that's the end of this. So it's worth bearing in mind, even if it is somebody who has got an academic background, who is, with a nominal share consideration to your business, or gives you something, it will give the person reading this a bit more comfort.
Yeah, and one of the things, I don't know what you think about this, but one of the things someone said to me was about when you have the team members and you have partnerships or 2 or 3 members, a lot of people omit the details about the relationship between people and how long you've known each other. Because I've heard investors say that, well, what if these guys have just met and they're going to fall out after a few months? That's my money gone, right?
Absolutely. I think, it's very interesting. I was at the award ceremony yesterday, and there was a lady who's quite well known in the East Midlands, in the university sphere, on the subject of innovation and ideation. And she said, I always tell our PhDs, professors, and graduates when they're launching ventures that picking a co-founder is far more stringent of a task than selecting the eventual person that you want to live with or get married to. I think that's one. I think the other thing that people, maybe Dave, turning to your point, a lot of people don't want to admit this, but I think it's really honesty is the best policy. If you met someone or you were introduced to someone who had a certain set of skills or competencies that you don't, you've got an agreement. You need 5-page agreement with between yourselves. I mean, these are just basic housekeeping rules, and some people don't even have this.
Yep.
It's not just a handshake and then going the other way, or known this person since school days, we were best mates, rode a bike together, etc. You must have a clear separation of roles and responsibilities, but also a very good understanding of your legal responsibility to the company, because the company is an organism in its own right, but also subsequently, as you do go and pitch for investment, what those responsibilities need to be, both as a founding team or two founders, vis-a-vis an investor and what they want. So I think that a lot of people are quite reticent, which is wrong, in telling it the way it is. And if you have any inkling, frankly, if your gut instinct says no, it's probably right.
Mm.
And behind all the scientific assessments and mathematical calculations, I can tell you, having spoken to far too many investors over the years, there's a lot of this. There's this gut instinct.
I'd be fascinated to understand what that is, because that a lot of that is very kind of under the radar of consciousness, right? I mean, is there something you could put your finger on when you read through a deck and it's an immediate red flag, which kind of destroys the whole thing for you?
Yeah. So one of the things which this is a bit controversial. Yeah, people talk about total addressable market.
Mm-hmm.
So if I got 0.00000001 of that addressable market, we'd be a unicorn.
Yep.
Really? And where did you get the statistic? KPMG, McKinsey, or whoever else you try. So I think the total addressable market is a really, really it is relevant, but it is also a big indication of as to how someone is going, how they think, and how they communicate. So that just the overall tonality of your deck when you open it, right? So if you remember, I was saying problem, solution, traction,
Yep.
ask, team, and that's what I was interested in.
Yep.
And the reason I'm interested in that is that a total addressable market, you may not be in the right market.
Yep.
Depending on the stage of you may have developed an MPV. For example, I know a company that's developed a gratuities app, right? But they've developed something for the third sector, so for religious organizations to stop people from pilfering the donation box and the offertory at church, right? So across the religions, they've developed something which can be light touch, very easy, digital, done, device, immediate reconciliation, money held in have held no more than 24 hours, probably even less, remitted to the account, and there's clear reconciliation. It's very clever.
Mm-hmm.
Their business is getting traction on the company's actually called URock, is getting traction with food retailers and also restaurants, because it's able to process 2 transactions at once and ensure that the entire gratuity goes to the waiter or waitress. Right?
Yep.
Now, funnily enough, if they spend a disproportionate amount of time on the third sector, it may be a slightly longer adoption curve for customers, but for want of a better word, the loyalty of that audience and then its capacity to spread geographically, both domestically in the UK and internationally, when you look at it, it's a very different proposition than just chasing after corporates.
Yeah.
So you might be focusing on the wrong market, or you may need to dial down on one to accelerate on another, because actually adoption will have less friction or might take a bit more time relative to your bandwidth. So I think a lot of the time people get caught up with total addressable market, size of addressable market, then market penetration rates, compound annual growth rates, fuse these things together to give people a number or a set of numbers that say, yes, absolutely, this is how this is going to work. You and I both know life is not linear.
Would you rather they even omitted those slides than to take that 0.001% approach?
to be very frank, if someone's got an MPV and a customer or a customers, if they can say, well, we've got another 30 or 40 customers that we
Yep.
think we could go after, this is the example, I think people will believe you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I oh,
that's the other bit.
hmm.
Believability.
Yes. Credibility, believability, trust. Absolutely. I always find it hard to advise on those slides, the total addressable market and the projections, because they're such an unknown quantity. And I do like to focus a lot on traction and realistically how you can go about, because a lot of these people, they have these amazing apps or products, and there is huge potential in lots of different markets, but they haven't even looked at them yet. So I think to put them into a slide where, you know, saying, oh, this market's worth this market's worth this. I mean, I think I don't know what your thoughts are, but for me, I think it's more realistic just to go from the bottom up approach.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, I don't think you've ever seen a pitch deck that doesn't have a hockey stick in it in
Yeah,
terms of growth,
yeah.
right? So it's okay. Let's take that as that baseline, right? So my own personal thinking, what I look for, really three scenarios. Nothing changes or it gets worse.
Mm-hmm.
So you can illustrate that with a graph, income, time, what have you,
Right.
based on your forecast as an assumption for a year, 2 year period. I think 3 years is pretty difficult to try and give people any sense of uh, um, long-term potential, because I think even in a year things could be hugely variable. Anyone who was raising money pre-COVID and then COVID happened,
Yep.
I'm sure you no way you could have forecast for that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one. I think you would then want to say let's take an assumption of the sort of 20% of what we want to happen happens, and then your other would be a reflection of, right, we think everything that we're working to based on our current experience, this is the sort of hockey stick within reason. And I
Mm-hmm.
think if you were to give people that, and also communicate again in your deck, these
Mm.
are assumptions that we have made based on current traction to this date. We have given as follows, bang, here are the three. And then in person, be willing to say to angel investors or early stage VC funds, look, we're not oracles. We can't give you the absolute black and white or for our forecast, but this is what we aim to do. If we have to pivot, if we have to adjust, we are ever willing to do that based on your experience as the capital in the room. Your thoughts on where perhaps we need to revisit our figures. We're not static. If you can have mature conversations, and that's, I think, the other thing, Dave, is that people produce a deck, right? It's a bit like a manifesto, for want of a better word.
Mm.
But you well know that manifestos, when a government is formed, if it's going from opposition into government, not a government that's getting another cycle, then a whole load of things that they promise people, they suddenly realize there's no money to do it.
Mm.
Right. So when you get there, it's like the biggest missell on the planet. And everyone's irritated, and within 6 months there's a whole load of new disasters, etc. And hey presto, we have got a completely different agenda. It's no different to raising money.
Mm.
You're presenting a story which has to be attractive enough with a trajectory that does look promising, and at the same time, it's I often describe it to being, how insurance is a subject which doesn't really excite people, right? You have to have a home and contents policy. You have to have a critical illness policy, but you have to have car insurance. There are certain public liability, professional indemnity, all these policies, right? But somebody who is able to basically say, well, look, these are the true risks. This is where it could go wrong. This is what we've learned. This is where we're going. Is where I believe there is the chance for you to have a conversation with investor or investors, that they go, actually, this is not somebody who is trying to sell us a dream that doesn't exist. I think people have moved on fundamentally from that sort of growth at all costs discussion, partly because of interest rates, global macroeconomic conditions, etc. But I do think for you as a founder, you must be able to articulate that.
Mm.
In what you say, you need to convey to the person that, look, I'm a rational being. I recognize things can go wrong. And people don't do that. People think, oh, if you send that to a VC, they only want, or you send it to an angel investor, they only want to hear a good story. You'll be surprised.
Yeah, they want to hear a good story, or they want to see exploding growth. I mean, I'm absolutely right. I've seen hundreds of pitch decks, like you have, and they almost always have a hockey stick or a absolutely massive spike up to profits.
You,
And
you, you never see anything other than the Nike tick, right? You don't see
yeah,
something that says like a heart monitor or some variable between the two.
so but I have seen a few decks that do that, nothing changes, a medium scenario and best case scenario. And I remember actually one of the things that a lot of people cite is the Uber deck. And I think they did that in the Uber deck. I don't know if you've ever got a chance to read that, but
Well, I
I
haven't seen
think
the Uber deck.
I think it was either Uber deck or it was the what's the one with the
Airbnb?
Airbnb,
No.
that's the one. Airbnb and Uber are the two main ones that people cite. And I think in one of those they had a nothing changes, worst case scenario or best case scenario. And in those cases it was the actual scenario that happened was much higher than the best case scenario they could ever imagine, because they're completely unique. But I do think that it's interesting you saying that about the honesty, and because if you can predict things that are still stable and you can still survive even if everything goes wrong, that's quite a good trait, right? I mean, just that you're prepared for that, especially with COVID, and now we're seeing, war in Ukraine, all this other stuff that's looking not very good. So yeah, I mean, that's great advice. That's great advice. I might start building that into my projects now.
Well, I mean, I got that actually. So part of my
Mm.
current work involves the government's innovation agency, Innovate UK. So we
Yep.
have a program called Edge, which does this investability, investor readiness, helping people MPV plus, and then try and sell more things abroad. But one of the things on this investability, investment readiness that came out with a conversation actually with a portfolio client. With a large fund based it has a significant presence in the Midlands and nationally, was one of the principals turned around and he said, it was an open forum, and he said, look, I am tired of people coming in to pitch to us who do not understand this. Because it is a red flag for us, because it demonstrates that you as a founder are blind, or founding team are frankly blindsided, in a metaphorical sense, that you will not pay attention to what's going on around you and in and around you, right? So you might have landed the client of choice for your MPV, which translates into a subscription, let's say.
Yep.
But there's something that happens within the market that determines that actually the spend on SaaS-based solutions within your subsect is on a declining scale, right? For whatever reason that is, either increase in competition, squeeze on margins, whatever. And you are adamant that you're going to buck the trend.
Well, that's interesting you say that. But so are there any circumstances where you would believe those things, or do you look at the market growth as a whole first, and that paints the picture as to what you're going to invest in? Is there anything that could buck it?
So it's a good question. What I think about, so you can't be, well, my world is very much looking about bigger trends, right? So I spend a huge amount of time reading, assimilating, listening, and I'm always saying that I'm ready to learn every single day of the week, because I don't for a moment think I have even a 10% grasp of what's going on at a very, very high level, because you need to be sat at that level on a daily basis. So I'm very mindful of that and my own personal inadequacies. So consequently, based on that rationale, I then look at, right, if I was sat in those founders' shoes and I'm trying to even if I'm trying to buck the market, well, then what's the strategy to buck the market? So, for example, in the SaaS world, I have, with again talking about a company, as a company called Predictiva, part of our portfolio, Innovate, and he and his co-founder worked out. They do artificial intelligence for investment managers, and it's a deep learning tool. They worked out that the bigger aspect for their business was to get assets under management, not just selling SaaS-based subscriptions, right? So they worked out they came up with an inflection point where actually it's more beneficial for their client to just give them money under management in their trading arm, which they're fully regulated to do that, than it is to try and sell more software user licenses. So that's a way of bucking a trend, right? So in his marketplace, he's saying configuration, license fee, and a success component, which has a floor. So depending on the size of the fund, no matter what happens, whether you go slightly up or down, based on it, you have a minimum, let's say 100K fee, right? So he's bucking a trend or esteemed wisdom in a market that is inherently price elastic with a plethora of competitors. But then his differentiation is that he can give the fund the ability to do it, or he can do it for them, right? And then his revenue model adapts to their strategic objectives, which then you're arguing in a very turbulent global economic marketplace. This guy is challenging convention. Now, it's borne out because the first deal is 3 million over 3 years with an initial fee of £500,000, which with a fund where, frankly, in the current climate, and he's now raising 2.5 million, that's not a small order. So when I first saw his thing and I started doing some research, immediately for me was, actually, isn't there a better play here than trying to sell more software licenses? Now, the plus is he was kind of thinking that way. And he also felt that, yeah, I'd grasped what he was really trying to do, which was to actually focus on assets under management.
It's really interesting that post-investment, you were able to steer the company. Do you think that does that happen quite a lot? Like your own ideas and influence ends up? No,
because I think one of the biggest challenges, depending on check sizes, right? So if you go to the funds, let's take the journey up to Series A, right? So you said pre-seed, seed, and then pre-Series A, then Series A. That's the world of where the large majority of people are seeking funds. Anecdotally, 5,000 pitch decks in circulation in Britain at any given time, 0.6% of founders succeed. That's Octopus Ventures talking. They see 8,000 decks, 8 to 10,000 decks. They do 25, 28 deals a year. So the biggest problem when people talk about even portfolio management or angel investors becoming non-executive directors, there's this fine line between, are you an active, passive, passive, active? Or are you somebody who, because you've invested at a very riskier stage, you are wanting to micromanage these people? Then there is I would say, a more mature look, which is, right, actually, hang on a minute, we've put money towards this, or we've pulled this capital to go in here. Someone has to be at it. And I think one of the hardest parts in this raising money business as a whole is that active portfolio management and engagement with the people who've put money in. A lot of times people say, oh, the type of investor I want is with these types of relationships, can get me into this company, get me into that. The truth is, if they've got a portfolio of even 5 companies that they have put money to at your ticket size, or perhaps more, or a spread, or what have you, they still got a life outside your world. So how many people want to do that? Well, I'm sort of a bit different in that I want to take on things where I can see, everyone wants to try and claim they can find a unicorn or a dedicorn or back one. there are some people who could legitimately say they've done that, the likes of the Peter Thiels of this world. But we all have to recognize our own reality. So I look for runners and riders in a very sort of simplistic way, people who there could be a pivot. That pivot could take you into a different uh, sort of, I would say, sort of different market per se, but that can take you into a different class or within your peer group. So if you were to imagine, school days, set one, set two, set three in 1 year, this was a special set that was created at the bottom because basically people were struggling, but you suddenly found your rhythm. And so the next calendar year, you could be in set two. So being able to find those types of founders, because then the competition for them, what they're doing, just generally the investor conversations, there isn't that much noise around them because the top 1% will always be oversubscribed and people will be running behind it.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay, well, let's think about you've read the deck, you're happy with the deck, you're excited about it. I want us to think about the next stage, the stages of the meeting, the phone call, or the insight meeting. How do you conduct the next stage of that process once you've decided on a deck that you like? What's next for you?
It's really a polite barbecue. There's no other way of describing it. They're going to be sitting on it. Because you need to very quickly, do people really believe what they say? Do they
Right.
have a grasp of, numbers tell a good story? But then at the same time, again, I come back to this absolute mantra, which is problem solution. You will find, even when you've read a deck or you've had, and my preference is a one pager, you will find that people, just a little bit of questioning, either they get incredibly nervous or anxious. If there is a condition there, they need to let you know. People can't second guess. I mean, I think I told you, and I work with people with invisible conditions. I've done a lot of that. That helps me get better at maintaining that level of emotional intelligence and getting better at that as well. So that's one. And two, you know, less is more. I don't need to know absolutely everything because that initial meeting is, can this person tell me a good story or people tell me a good story that is believable? And I am 100% confident, having seen so many and listened to so many. In 10 seconds you've made your mind up.
Right. So what is it in those 10 seconds? Is it charisma? Is it confidence? Is it the ability to answer those difficult questions on your feet, or all of those things?
Those are some of those things, but actually I think, Dave, is just when someone starts talking, or just the way they have written whatever you've read, or so a lot of the time I've found with mature investors, as in funds, they often haven't read all the details deliberately. Like, I don't read a lot of things before because I don't want a confirmation bias.
Right.
I'm trying to look at it objectively to give that person. So for me it's very simple. I listen. If it's not for me or not for anyone that I know, or just generally I'm working now, some things are a little different because of the type of funds and investor partnerships that are going on and things that we've got in the background. So you just go, right, no, this is the reason why. If I was you, I would suggest this. Now, some, I flippantly, people might say, well, that's just very direct, isn't it? You can't audition for Santa Claus. You can't give everybody a gift. One and two, if you can have that discussion with someone that is constructive critical feedback,
Yep.
that should help you on your journey. And if you're able to accept that or receive that and even get into that conversation, again, that will help you. People will be very gracious. I found this even when I first
Yeah.
started pitching 25 years ago, and I used to get things wrong and sort of be super aggressive, walk in the door and say, okay, look, I could tell you anything you want. This is what we do, X, Y, and Z. Why isn't it a fit for you? I mean, people, that may be appreciated in some very high pressure, time poor environments, but not necessarily so. So you just need to be very mindful that people can make their mind up in, forgive the tautology, make their mind up in 10 seconds flat. And they normally do. And gut instinct never lies. And first impressions count.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's interesting that when you talk about, I always sort of say that you don't really learn very much from praise, but you do learn a lot from criticism. And if you can improve based on that, and you listen to what people say, and especially if you hear the same sorts of things more than 3 times. But you also said something very interesting there, which I think a lot of founders don't realize, that you said if it wasn't for you or anyone else you know. So, for example, if you saw something and they did present well, I think a lot of founders don't realize that the fact that a lot of investors like yourself, they will actually hand it to other investors, and that becomes part of a bigger network. I mean, is there anything in particular that you've thought, okay, it's not for you, but you've known someone that it is perfect for, and you've handed it off and it's managed to get investment?
There are people. So I look at it a bit. I look at it. Yes, there are things, but I also look at it like this. So if you can't add value to that
Mm.
conversation, you have a duty to stop it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's also a danger with this whole founder investor chat, that, or investor chats, or investment representatives, agencies, all these things that exist there, is people are often not actually able to get an answer from the money. That sounds mad, but it is true. That's one. And two, there've been a couple of times where I've thought, okay, I quite like what they've done, but I just have no chemistry with the people.
Right.
And then I wouldn't, then you're not minded to pick up the phone or do something.
Okay.
And then there are other people, like I know one company, I mean, for the couple of funds that I work with, it was too early. They said no. I knew they would say no. But just the way this female founder and her co-founder presented,
Mm.
I met up with them for coffee, made some phone calls. I mean, I'm not asking to be a hero, given an award for this or Samaritan or anything like that, but just to illustrate the point. It's a pleasure. I still stay in touch. There's
Mm.
a non-profit that has got a tech platform. Still stay in touch, constantly trying to find out what they're doing, because I just liked what they were doing.
Mm.
But it wasn't something that I could get some capital or pool capital to actually do it. So I just let it. But yeah, there are things like that. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I want to move on now to talk about. So I want to try and sort of cover this sort of linear journey from initial contact through to reading the pitch deck, being impressed by that, then the interview, being impressed with that. Now, what comes after that? I'm talking more like the due diligence process. How does that come about, and how do you orchestrate that?
It's really an external team, and it happens pretty quickly.
Right.
There are some basics that you need to have in your due diligence list, your data room, confirmation of where you are, if you have some issues relating to patents submitted or pending, submitted and received or pending. There's a standard checklist, and those things are looked at pretty quickly. I'm a little different in that I don't want to waste time, in a back and forth and a Donkey Kong type exercise. I just want to quickly get to the nub of it and say, right, yeah, we can do this. No, we can't. And I'm not saying everyone's like that. Um, and I'm not saying everyone should be like that, but you should try to imagine that, literally the here's one I made earlier. That when you get into a serious conversation about due diligence, the relevant aspects are there. That should be frankly a baseline, David.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people don't. They go, okay, they sort of freeze and they get to that point of due diligence, or they have some notional ideas, or they haven't been upfront with the person they're speaking to who has the money or
Mm.
represents the money to say, right, what do you need to see in due diligence? Do you have a standard schematic? Do you have a standard package? Do you issue us with a certain documentation? Is exclusive, non-exclusive? Is the limitation period? Some basics which I just think people don't even ask for.
It's interesting that I think people don't realize that you actually assign it to a team. What sort of things would come back that would then halt it from that team that found? what sort of skeletons would they unearth that automatically say no?
I think people sometimes don't realize that people can do a Google search. Sounds silly. It's true. Financials that look ridiculous.
Right.
That's a lot of it. Legal agreements that are tenuous or excessively long, with various class and whatever. Some people have this whole territorial thing over non-disclosure agreements. You can understand it for things that might involve the military or biopharma or what have you, but largely technology readiness levels, etc. People get very stuck up on NDAs. Not really the greatest. And just rare, basics. Are your documents in order? Do you have the bits that we want to see? If you want to speak to a customer, what would you have to do for that? Lots of things, that just common sense, really. And I think, in all the times I've worked on due diligence with founders, and then done that for other people, and then worked with, because my late father was a lawyer, so I had to do this 15, 20 years ago for people putting money into bricks and mortar, but also people putting money into businesses and ventures and taking partnership agreements and all those kind of things. If you have something to hide, the experience that I've seen or witnessed, or call it what you like, it is down to the fact that someone just starts acting in a very opaque way. And speed is a funny one to filter that out.
Okay. How many, it might be hard to put a number on it, but can you sort of think of, off the top of your head, a number of deals that have fallen on that hurdle? Has it been many, or have most of them gone through okay?
Several.
Yeah, but as a percentage, how many do you think have faltered in that? Is it like 10%? Is it a quarter, or is it just a very small percentage?
It's about 10%. 10%.
Right.
It is, again, it's a cliche. It's about 10% will just fail. For any reason, you might get cold feet, or the people you're doing something with get cold feet. It can happen. I always say to people, it's not an investment until the money has actually hit your bank account and you can draw on it. People go, oh, right, yes. So it isn't. I've been in plenty on the other side of the table raising money for ventures, been at the final day, DD's done, we're at a closing, and someone just goes, no, we don't want to do it. We'll pay the abortive fee cost by.
Right.
So, that can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, almost at the end. So I'd like to ask you one question that might be a little bit, I don't know, of a sore spot, but tell us about the one that got away. What was the one that you wish you'd invested in, and for some reason it didn't?
Yeah. So that's a really good one. So I was working with an ex Big Four colleague, and we were doing cap raising. We'd managed to persuade someone to do something quite interesting, and with us in terms of a disaster risk play. And there was a company called Vault Vision, which was very interesting in terms of power-based. Sorry, the phone is going. Just give me one second.
We can't hear it, actually. If you can grab it and I can edit it out afterwards if you want.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
So Vault Vision was a very interesting company in terms of power monitoring and maintenance for transformers in mines. Fascinating business. They developed a technology where you could basically right size the power supply for a mine, and you could do that sitting anywhere in the world using a laptop and a transformer and a relay switch. So just, but I think it was clash of personalities. I do wish them well. But I also have funny things sometimes in life. I think I may have said this to you in the past. There's a thing called karma. You just got to wait for things to play out. And there is a very interesting relationship between patience and impatience. There's a gap between those 2 points. And I think the older I get, the more focused I am on that gap. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so it's a good company. I think they are definitely going places. They've got several solutions now to clunky problems, and they're building an AI-based system and also a library of footprints of these different power stations. So effectively in a mine, or the, you could, for want of a better word, have a footprint that if you wanted a power station of X description to serve Y community in, outer Mongolia, these guys could actually tell you what you really needed
Mm.
before you even put a fork in the ground.
Do you know the investors that did end up investing?
No, no, I don't. I don't. I sort of, when you have a clash, you sort
Mm.
of politely excuse yourself.
Sure.
Which seems to be the best way to do it.
Yeah, sure. Okay. And the very final point, and I just wanted to sort of like summarize any sort of bits of killer advice that you could give to anyone that's looking to fundraise right now in the current climate, 2023, and beyond that.
I think the money is still the kingmaker. Talk about what you need over 3 years. You need twice as much in half the time. It's an absolute rule stick. Problem solution. Be very, very clear on that. And less is more. Really understand who you're talking to. But my number one tip, number one tip, you've got 2 ears and one mouth.
Yep.
Use it in that order.
Yep. And I've enjoyed using my 2 ears to listen to your advice, and I'm sure everyone else listening to this will as well. So thank you so much for doing this. There's so many little nuggets of brilliant information there. And yeah, let's stay in touch, and when this comes out, I'll give you a shout, and hopefully everyone will like it. But thank you so much.
Thanks, Dave. Take care. All the best.
Take care.
Cheers. Bye.